Episode 4. Casey. Casey couldn't breathe. A thick, searing liquid filled his lungs. He started to open his eyes, but someone stabbed dull knives into the middle of his forehead until the pain forced him to keep them shut. He tried to groan, but something had been shoved in his mouth. He reached towards it. A tube had been forced down his throat. He could feel his chest rise and fall with mechanical regularity as air was forced into his lungs. He tried to breathe against the relentless pressure, but succeeded only in making himself choke. The coughing fit that followed made his chest hurt even worse. Somewhere beyond the haze of pain and partial suffocation was a high-pitched beeping, each tone an impact drill carving into his eardrums. Desperate, Casey wrapped his hands around the tube and pulled with everything he had. Braided razor wire tore through his larynx. He tried to scream, but all that came out was a weak rasp. Pain flooded out from his chest, reaching crimson fingers across his back and into his arms and belly. Seeking an escape and unable to do much else, he curled into a fetal position. It took several moments for him to realize he was once again breathing under his own power. Casey worked open his eyes by stages, each fraction of an inch a greater victory than the construction of Neil's dome itself. As he did so, he tried to piece together scraps of memory into a collage that made some form of sense. Thoughts whirled around his mind like flies trapped in a windowless room, no single image or sound landing long enough for him to fully grasp. He knew that he had dreamed. He couldn't remember much of it, but he knew that she had been there. Her almond-shaped eyes watching him, their color like pools of dark honey. While she was alive, those eyes had humbled him with their warmth and patience. Casey had fallen in love. In the dream, they had been filled with what he feared, what he knew would be there. Casey could have understood accusation or contempt. Righteous fury, even hatred, would have made sense and been something he almost welcomed. He had killed her, after all. Instead, her eyes had only been filled with pain. Oceans of pain, bred of confusion, as if asking what she did wrong other than sleeping with a selfish coward like himself. It was an icicle in Casey's brain. The sound of flies swarmed, filling his head as they would surely have swarmed over her swiftly cooling body, circling, landing, feasting. He fell back into merciful darkness. When Casey reawoke, the pain was gone. He kept his eyes closed, simply feeling the rise and fall of his chest with each breath. It was bliss. After several moments of this, he decided to open his eyes. They still hurt, but the pain wasn't as severe. He had to squint and blink through a haze of tears, but the space around him soon came into focus. He didn't know where he was. The walls were covered in sky blue padding. There was no furniture except a sink and small bedside table. Something was attached to the ceiling. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. It looked like an upside-down willow tree made of chrome and black rubber. In place of green fronds, a series of tubes dangled limply towards the ground. One of the tubes was longer than the others, angling down and disappearing under the blankets, its outline clearly visible in the space between his legs. He sat up to get a better look, but the movement was arrested. His arms suddenly twisted and jerked in the wrong direction. It wasn't painful, but Casey found it impossible to resist being pulled back onto the mattress. He looked down the length of his body, seeing whatever it was that had him in its grip. Padded handcuffs had been placed on each of his wrists and ankles. The cuffs were attached to straps that disappeared into the bed frame on which he was laying. He once again tried to move, this time simply raising his arms. They got about 6 inches from his body before the straps grew taut, pulling his arms back to his sides with relentless force. So, he was a prisoner. Casey tried to feel surprised, even angry, but instead he just felt tired. Blandly, he returned his focus to the tree, studying its trunk this time. Rather than bark, the thing was covered in an assortment of shining metal scales. He began to count them, attempting to take his mind off the growing knot of worry in his stomach. He got to 128 scales on the side facing him, and was just starting to work out how many would be on the opposite side of the trunk, when the room's door opened. A woman Casey didn't recognize stepped in. While she wore the same pocketed coverall as the other suppliers, rather than a tool vest, she had on a simple white coat patterned with a series of reflective red crosses. Her features were striking. Thick waves of gray-streaked black hair ended at a strong, almost masculine jawline. Her eyes were bright needles, one icy blue, the other a deep brown, set under brows so thick they nearly met. There was something in the way she held herself, a nameless aura that communicated not only self-assurance, but a right to command. It flowed out of her in waves, stating that here was a woman who had authority and knew how to wield it. "Mr. Howell?" she asked, face impassive as a glacier. "Mr. Casey Howell?" "Yes?" Casey asked. "My name is Diana Ingram. I am Ingram's wife and the head of our medical subsection. How are you feeling?" "Better than I was," Casey replied. Then, with dawning realization, he asked, "Is this a hospital?" "Yes," Diana answered, walking to the foot of the bed. "Ingram brought you here himself. Now, lay still while I get these tubes out of you." She unceremoniously lifted the blankets. A rush of embarrassment flooded through Casey as he realized for the first time that he was completely naked. The cuffs around his ankles tightened, pulling his legs into a knees-up position. "Couldn't you get a guy in here to do this?" "Sorry, Mr. Howell," Diana said. "Ingram ordered that only I am allowed to do any procedures on you, even something as simple and humiliating as this." The sound of something being peeled apart filled the room, followed by the smell of some type of antiseptic. Something cold and wet was wiped around Casey's genitals. "Take a deep breath," Diana said, her voice distant and professional. Casey inhaled as much as he could, bracing for whatever would come next. As he exhaled, something slithered out of both ends, sending a lightning shock from his crotch up the base of his spine. The tube which had descended from the tree retracted itself, disappearing back into its foliage. Casey's legs were once again allowed to stretch out. Diana replaced the blankets without comment. She removed a pair of white rubber gloves that she had put on, disposing of them through a panel in the wall. After washing her hands in the sink, she came to the side of the bed and manipulated controls that Casey couldn't see. He was raised into a sitting position, but his hands and ankles remained bound. Diana pulled a chair from a hidden recess in the wall and sat next to the bed. "Can you let me out of these things?" Casey asked, raising his hand and shaking the cuff at Diana before it was dragged back into place. "I could," Diana responded, "but I'm not convinced it's safe to do so." "Why not?" Casey asked. The knotted, nervous feeling in his gut started to grow, squirming like oversized mosquito larvae. Other than being a danger to yourself and others, you've done very little else since sneaking aboard, Diana said. Her voice was calm and carefully neutral, but her eyes speared through Casey. I didn't sneak aboard, Casey said defensively. Your hiring manager brought me on fair and square. Ask your husband. I have, Diana responded. Then you know that I have an agreement with him, an agreement which I can't uphold if you keep me here, Casey said, willing himself to speak calmly. I read up on some of your customs before coming aboard. You must release me. Diana's face remained impassive as she replied. That doesn't matter, Mr. Howell. My husband is our trade manager. As long as you are in that bed, his authority stops at this door. Right now, he still believes you to be unconscious. You and I are the only ones who know that you are awake. The nervous feeling inside of Casey was no longer squirming, but outright galloping and bucking like some immense, terrified creature. It took everything he had to keep his voice under control. What do you want? He asked. I want you to tell me the truth. Why did you really leave your community? Casey felt as if he was looking down a long corridor through which he could see all the events of the past several months. Each hard-edged detail glinted like teeth on a pristine saw blade, promising laceration upon contact. It's like I told Ingram. I killed someone. If you had really spoken with him, you would already know that. Tears began to sting in Casey's eyes. He raised a hand to wipe them away, but the merciless bed pulled it back down to his side. Are these really necessary? He asked. They are necessary until I'm convinced otherwise. Don't change the subject. Whom did you kill? Diana was standing now, fists clenched so tight they might have crushed diamond. My lover. And our child. Silence rang like a bell in the room. Diana's icy demeanor cracked momentarily, a look of shocked horror flooding her eyes before once again freezing over. Under the dome, we're all related. Most of us are cousins or clones of each other. The sisters themselves are clones of our founder, Dr. Neal. Casey felt his throat tightening, but even this couldn't stop the words from tumbling out. Months of guilt and shame flooded from him like a geyser. Because of this, who we have children with is strictly monitored, to prevent genetic defects from occurring. We were discovered. There was only an 8% chance of our child having a genetic abnormality, but the risk was too great for the sisters. Diana closed her eyes, brows furrowed as if searching inward. So why kill them? Because they would have killed Olivia anyway, and our baby would have been ripped out of her and turned into something no longer human, a living weapon, like the killer they sent after me. Casey's nose started to drip. He inhaled sharply, snuffing up his snot in an attempt to save some dignity. Why not try to bring them with you? Diana asked. Would your hiring manager have let us on board? Casey retorted, a harsh, sobbing laugh racking his chest. Shuffling in one person is doable, but taking on 2 passengers, one of them pregnant, there was just no way. Why not kill yourself with them? Diana's voice was hard and cold as polished marble. I've asked myself that question every day since coming aboard the Skunk Babe, Casey replied. Shame made his gaze heavy. His eyes were fixed down at the stitching of the blanket that covered him. Its pattern reminded him of well-packed snow covered in intersecting tire tracks. He couldn't bear to look at anything else. Diana heaved a deep sigh, as though she had just put down a heavy burden. Then she walked to the side of the bed and again used its controls. The restraints popped off Casey's wrists, and he immediately used the corner of the blanket to blow his nose. "If I find that you are lying to me, I'll kill you again myself," Diana said in a bland voice. It was as though she was discussing nothing more concerning than the weather. Casey started to nod, then froze. He looked up at her in shock as the memory of Olivia and thousands of flies came back to him. "What do you mean, again?" Diana seemed about to answer when a knock came at the door. She went to it and had a hushed conversation with the person on the other side. "Will do, thank you," was all Casey could hear as Diana once again closed the door. She turned to face him, holding a paper bag in one hand and a steaming cup of something in the other. She handed both to Casey. The cup turned out to be filled with coffee, and the bag with a chunk of meal loaf. He made a face at the warm, pink rectangle wrapped in slightly damp wax paper. "Eat it," Diana said. "It is easy to digest and nutrient-dense, both of which are exactly what you need." Casey's stomach rumbled despite his reservations. He bit into the loaf mechanically, washing each mouthful down with a sip of coffee. The loaf's texture was somewhere between bread and meat, its flavor the kind of thing food scientists dream of while on the verge of mental breakdown. He would never get used to the stuff, but the coffee helped and his hunger was steadily bludgeoned into submission. "You said you'd kill me again," Casey continued. "This implied that I already died once." Diana didn't say anything, so Casey took another bite of the loaf. "I remember being on fire. After that I was here, I think. There was a tube in my mouth." He spoke around the loaf, working his tongue to rid it of the slight film that was left behind. "I'd appreciate being told what happened." Diana sighed, her face softening, shedding a single atom-thin layer of its ice. "I was not one of those watching," she said. "If you want all the details, you will have to speak with Ingram." "I have been practicing medicine for most of my adult life, Mr. Howell. The killer used a toxin that I have never seen before. It shuts down neuroreceptors directly. Even if we had an antitoxin, the best-case scenario would be surviving with severe brain damage." "So, how did I survive?" Casey asked. "You did not," Diana responded. "You died for a full 7 minutes." Casey relived the fire that had gone up his back and spine, into his limbs, the sudden blackness that came after. And then, he shook his head, getting the sound of the flies out of his ears. It was only gradually that he realized Diana was still speaking. "I ran every kind of test and examination possible with an unconscious patient. So far, nothing explains your recovery." Diana stared hard at him, eyes furrowed as though studying a problem with a solution that was just beyond her reach. Her next words came slow, each one carefully chosen. "Perhaps, now that you are awake and seemingly stable, I can do more rigorous testing. Something new might pop up." Casey nodded. He suddenly wanted very much to be as far away from the hospital as possible. "When can I leave?" Casey asked, crumpling up the meal loaf's empty wrapper and placing it back in the paper bag. He held on to his unfinished coffee. "I'm meeting Ingram soon, in another part of the hospital in about 30 minutes, Diana said. "He's asked you to be there if you feel capable." "Sure," Casey said. "Where are my clothes?" "Under the bed," along with some toiletries," Diana responded. She then walked to one of the wall's padded panels and pulled out a small toilet sink combo. "I will give you some privacy while you get ready. You have about 15 minutes. 12 minutes later, Casey was dressed and feeling nearly human again. It took longer than he had expected to shave, his beard having grown several inches since his death. He wondered how long it had been since his admission to the Skunk Babes hospital, but decided he'd rather not know. Such a line of inquiry invited thoughts of just how long he'd been in that dream, faced with his dead lover and that swarm of flies. Diana led the way. They moved through virtually empty corridors. Other than a handful of nurses and orderlies, each dressed similarly to Diana, there was no one. In the weeks Casey had been aboard, he'd gotten used to crowds and virtually shoulder-checking his way to and from work. "Why is it so empty here?" he asked. "We're in the smaller of the Babes hospitals," Diana replied. "This is where the managers and higher-ranking crew get treated." "Then why bring me here?" Casey asked. "I'm just a passenger." "Because you are now one of our state secrets. No one, other than Ingram and myself, know that you are still alive. Our hope is to keep it that way." At last, Diana stopped in front of a door. It looked the same as all the others, except that on the wall next to it was a raised metal number pad. Diana entered a long series of numbers, and the door swung open automatically. The room was almost identical to the one in which Casey had been kept. The only glaring difference was a wall of clear plastic polymer that divided the room in half. Yellow lettering on its surface read, "Danger, do not break, non-oxygenated gas, suffocation hazard." Within the isolated space was a bed and no other furniture. A figure lay on that bed. It looked almost human, but it was desiccated, a dehydrated slab of meat. The figure was completely inert, its long frame strapped to the bed, sunken chest and lanky arms pressing into each other. Various electrodes and tubes extended from the withered figure, up into a machine that looked like a smaller version of the tree to which Casey had been connected. Some of the clear wall space had been partitioned as a screen that contained various charts and graphs. All but one showed a steady, flat line. Ingram sat on a bench that had been unfolded from the wall, but stood up as they entered. "Say hi to your killer, Case," Ingram said. "Not many people have the opportunity to outlive the person who murders them. It seems that you are especially fortunate." He gave Casey a lopsided, mischievous grin, which Casey did not return. "And hello, Diana," Ingram said. "Thank you for bringing him to our meeting, my love." He reached out, grabbing and kissing her hand. Diana's lips curved in a way that would have turned into a full-blown smile were they on anyone else's face. "Both of you, come take a look at our guest." "Are you insane?" Casey whispered, taking an instinctive step back from the shape on the bed. "Do you have any idea how dangerous this thing is?" Ingram waved his hand in a dismissive gesture. "Of course I do," he retorted. "That's why I put him in here." Ingram pounded on the see-through wall with the side of his fist, making Casey jump. "This is one of our quarantine cells," Ingram explained. "It's vacuum-sealed and constructed from a polymer that's 6 times harder than steel, completely isolated from the surrounding environment. Right now, we have it flooded with argon, just like down in the engine room." "Are you sure that's enough to keep this thing down?" Casey asked. "Fairly sure," Ingram responded. "I don't care what kind of genetic voodoo this guy has. Nothing animal can live without oxygen." Right, Di? Ingram turned to look at his wife for confirmation. Diana didn't answer right away, but stood for a moment, considering her reply. "It is not likely," Diana finally said. Casey still wasn't convinced. "What if it adapts?" he asked. "Using what energy?" Diana asked, shrugging her shoulders. "Change requires energy. Energy cannot be used in complex animal cells without the presence of oxygen. Unless he magically changes into a bunch of extremophile bacteria, which I doubt, there is no way on the continent this creature is escaping." "You should just decapitate him and leave his body in the wastes," Casey said. "He's already killed me once. As long as he's alive, he'll be looking for ways to do it again." "Casey, I understand that you're scared of this thing," Ingram said, his voice almost compassionate. "But you don't have a say. This is the third part of our agreement." "What do you want me to do?" Casey asked. Ingram answered with a question of his own. "Do you know how things work in Lavina?" Casey opened his mouth as if to respond, but fell silent, temporarily confused by the sudden change in topic. "Of course," he finally answered. "They're a plutocracy. It's the fastest growing community and one of the top consumers of the Dome's goods. It's also supposed to be grossly corrupt and a real shit stain for anyone who's part of the have-nots." "Very good," Ingram said, nodding. "And your plan to avoid being part of those have-nots is what, exactly? Just show up and hope for the best?" "Basically," Casey said. Ingram shook his head in disbelief. "One of our Lavina clients, a corporation called Adarac Inc., has been very interested in hiring someone from under the Dome for decades," Ingram explained. "They're willing to give you a position higher up in one of those towers. Higher is better, just for your information." "Great," Casey said without much enthusiasm. "When do I start?" "It's not quite that simple," Ingram said. "These corporate types are paranoid, and that's putting it lightly. They'll need to see that you're the real deal, so to speak. So for the next couple of weeks, you'll be working alongside my beautiful wife to analyze and describe what makes Killer here tick." He pointed at the figure on the bed. "I don't know anything about medicine, let alone genetics," Casey scoffed. "I specialize in fluid dynamics. I'm not sure what help I would even be." "Almost certainly none at all," Diana said with an arch look at her husband. "But it will also give me the chance to study how your brain works as you absorb new information. It is a long shot, but maybe there will be something I can find to explain how you survived." "Great," Casey said. "So, while I'm studying a homicidal piece of leather, going so far out of my field that it's laughable, I myself will be the subject of tests." "That sums it up very succinctly," Diana said. "Of course, you could say no and break your deal with Ingram. You'd once again become my responsibility." Casey shuddered involuntarily, not wanting to imagine the kinds of tests the woman would run on him if she were unsupervised. He was sure that the medical tree had a lot more in it than a few electrodes and some tubing. At the end of the day, Casey had made an agreement with a supplier, and now was stuck to following it through to the end. Besides, Ingram had the killer as locked down as humanly possible. "Listen," Ingram said, putting a companionable arm around Casey's shoulders. "All I want you to do is learn enough that the Adaracs feel like they're getting their money's worth. It can't be that hard for a smart guy like you to fake it a little bit." "Fine. I'll do my best," Casey said, ignoring every instinct in his body. "Of course you will," Ingram said. That's the kind of person you are. You have been listening to Dead Arcology, written and recorded by me, Michael K. Ostis. If you enjoyed this story, please consider sharing it. I have episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Podbean, as well as several others. Updates, schedules, and news can be found on the website, deadarcology.com, as well as on the social media apps Blue Sky and Instagram under the username Dead Arcology. If you want to help Dead Arcology grow more directly, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/deadarcology. Thank you again for listening. It really helps a lot. I very much appreciate you giving this story your time, and I will see you in about 2 weeks. Goodbye.